I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Brenda Patterson standing on my front porch with that clipboard, her lips pressed into a thin line that could cut glass. My name is Benjamin Jacobs, and I had been living in Cedar Ridge, Montana, for about 3 years when this whole mess started. I bought a decent 5-acre property on the outskirts of this planned community, specifically because I wanted space and the freedom to live how I saw fit. The mountains loomed in the background, pine trees scattered across the landscape, and winters here were brutal. That last part was important because it shaped everything about how I prepared for the colder months. "Can I help you, Brenda?" I asked, wiping my hands on my jeans. I had been splitting wood all morning and my pile was looking impressive. Stacked neatly along the side of my house, covered with tarps, I probably had enough firewood to last 2 winters. Behind that, visible from the driveway, were my propane tanks. 6 of them, all properly secured and sitting on concrete pads I had poured myself. "Benjamin, we need to talk about your property," she said, not even bothering with pleasantries. Brenda was the HOA president, a position she treated like she was running a military dictatorship rather than a neighborhood association. She was 52, always wore pearl necklaces even when doing yard work, and had made it her personal mission to ensure every home in Cedar Ridge looked like it came straight out of a catalog. "What about it?" I crossed my arms, already feeling defensive. The HOA had been relatively quiet for the past few years, aside from the occasional reminder about keeping grass trimmed or not parking RVs in driveways. "This," she gestured dramatically at my woodpile and propane tanks, "this is unacceptable. It is an eyesore and violates our community standards." I blinked at her. "Violates what standards? I have firewood and backup propane. We live in Montana. This is normal. Normal or not, it exceeds reasonable quantities." "The HOA board convened yesterday, and we have determined that your stockpiling is excessive and depreciates the aesthetic value of the neighborhood." She thrust a paper at me from her clipboard. "This is your official notice. You have 30 days to reduce your firewood to no more than half a cord and remove all but 1 propane tank." I took the paper, reading it with increasing disbelief. Half a cord, that would not even get me through a month in winter, and 1 propane tank. My backup generator, water heater, and cooking stove all run on propane. This is ridiculous. "The rules are the rules, Benjamin. We all have to make sacrifices for the good of the community." Her voice had that patronizing tone that made my blood pressure spike. "Show me where in the original HOA bylaws it says anything about firewood or propane limits," I challenged. "The board has the authority to implement new standards as needed. It is in Section 12, subsection B of the covenant." She sniffed, adjusting her pearls. "You signed those documents when you purchased your property." I had signed them, yes, but I also remembered reading them thoroughly. Section 12. Subsection B gave the board authority to maintain community standards, but it was vague and definitely did not specify anything about reasonable quantities of heating fuel. This felt like a massive overreach, and I told her so. "Take it up with the board if you disagree," Brenda said, turning on her heel. "But the notice stands. 30 days, Benjamin, or we will be forced to fine you." She left, and I stood there holding that ridiculous notice, anger simmering in my gut. I went inside and immediately pulled out my copy of the HOA documents. After 2 hours of reading through the dense legal language, I confirmed what I suspected. There was nothing specific about firewood or propane. The board was interpreting their authority very liberally. Over the next week, I tried reasoning with them. I sent emails to all 5 board members explaining why I needed the fuel stores. Montana winters were unpredictable. We had lost power for 8 days 2 years ago during an ice storm. My preparations were not hoarding, they were survival necessities. Every email I got back was a form response, basically telling me to comply or face fines. The fines started on day 31, $50 per day. I refused to pay them and refused to remove my supplies. Brenda escalated, sending certified letters threatening liens on my property. That was when I decided to dig deeper into exactly what was going on. Cedar Ridge had about 200 homes, spread across several phases of development. My property was in Phase 1, the original section built about 15 years ago. As I started talking to neighbors, I learned some interesting things. First, I was not the only one who had received notices about various violations. Martha Henderson, 3 doors down, had been cited for having too many garden beds. Rick Morrison across the street got hit for parking his work truck in his own driveway because it had his company logo on it. Second, and more interesting, was what I learned about Brenda's family connections. Her brother-in-law, Derek Sullivan, owned Sullivan Property Management, the company the HOA paid to handle administrative tasks and maintenance. I started requesting financial records, which as a homeowner I had the right to see. It took another month and a threat to lawyer up before I got them. What I found was enlightening. Sullivan Property Management was billing the HOA about $15,000 per month for services. That seemed high for a community of 200 homes. I compared it to similar-sized HOAs in the area and found we were paying roughly triple the going rate. Even more suspicious, there were regular charges for maintenance and repairs that I had never seen evidence of. I documented everything and started building a case, but winter was coming fast. It was late October, and temperatures were already dropping at night. I kept my firewood and propane exactly where they were, and the fines kept accumulating. Brenda sent me a letter stating I now owed the HOA over $3,000 in fines. Then I discovered something that changed the entire game. I was at the county recorder's office pulling more documents when I stumbled across the original land development plans for Cedar Ridge. The property had been developed by a company called Mountain Vista Developments, and according to the records, they had installed a central propane distribution system for the entire community. It was buried underground, feeding individual homes through a network of pipes. That was unusual but not unheard of in planned communities. What made it interesting was the next document I found. The propane supplier had an exclusive contract with Cedar Ridge HOA, and the system was managed by, surprise, surprise, Sullivan Property Management. Every home in Cedar Ridge, including mine, had their propane automatically billed through the HOA fees, added as a line item each month based on usage. But here was the kicker. I had my own independent propane tanks because when I moved in, I had disconnected from the community system. The previous owner had told me it was overpriced, and he had already started the process of switching to independent tanks. I had simply finished what he started, installing my own supplier relationship with a local company that gave me much better rates. I went home and started making calls. I found 8 other homeowners who had also disconnected from the community propane system over the years for the same reason. All of them had their own tank setups. None of them had been cited for violations. Only me. That was when I understood what was really happening. Brenda was not concerned about aesthetics. She was concerned about the precedent I was setting. If other homeowners saw my independent setup and realized they could cut their propane costs by 30% or more, they would disconnect too. That would hurt Sullivan Property Management's bottom line, and by extension, benefit Brenda's family financially. I needed leverage, So I kept digging. Through casual conversations with my closest neighbor, Tom, I learned that he was an engineer who had actually worked on the original propane system installation years ago, before he retired and bought his house here. I invited him over for coffee. "Tom, what can you tell me about the community propane system?" I asked once we were settled in my living room. He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "It is a decent system, pretty standard for developments like this. Why do you ask?" "Because I think there might be some issues with how it is being managed." I showed him the financial records I had obtained, pointing out the charges from Sullivan Property Management. His eyebrows rose. "That is excessive. The system basically runs itself once it is installed. You need quarterly inspections and the occasional repair, but nothing that would justify these costs." "What if I told you the HOA president's brother-in-law owns Sullivan Property Management?" Tom whistled low. "That is a conflict of interest if I have ever seen one. Have you reported this?" "Not yet. I wanted to make sure I had all my facts straight first." I paused, then asked the question that had been nagging at me. "Is there any way to shut down the community propane system?" Tom set down his coffee cup, looking at me seriously. "There are shut-off valves at the main distribution point." "Why would you want to do that?" "I do not necessarily, but I want to know if it is possible, and I want to understand what would happen if someone did." He explained that the system had a primary valve at the connection point, where the supplier's main line fed into the community distribution network. It was located in an underground vault on the edge of the property, accessible with a standard utility key. If someone shut that valve, every home still connected to the community system would lose their propane supply. "But that would be illegal, right?" I asked. "I mean, even if someone had a reason, they could not just shut off people's gas." "Technically, it depends on who owns the system. If the HOA owns it, then the HOA has control. Individual homeowners who are connected have rights to service, but the HOA board has authority over maintenance and operations." He frowned. "Why are you asking these questions, Ben?" I told him everything. The violations notice, the fines, my research into the financials, my suspicion that Brenda was targeting me specifically to protect her family's profit stream. Tom listened with growing concern. "That is serious," he said when I finished. "If she is abusing her position for personal financial gain, that could be fraud. But you need to be careful how you handle this. Do not do anything that could land you in legal trouble." "I would not," I assured him, "but I want them to understand that they are not the only ones with leverage here." November arrived with the first real snowfall. 6 inches overnight, and temperatures dropped to 15 degrees. I fired up my wood stove and my backup generator, comfortable and warm while the wind howled outside. The fines from the HOA had now exceeded $5,000, and Brenda had sent another letter threatening to put a lien on my property and begin foreclosure proceedings. That was when I decided to call her bluff. I contacted a lawyer, Patricia Rodriguez, who specialized in HOA disputes. She reviewed everything I had gathered and gave me a grim smile. "You have a strong case," she said. "The targeting, the conflict of interest, the excessive management fees, this is all actionable. But HOA foreclosures are real and they can move quickly in Montana. We need to be proactive." "What do you recommend?" "First, we file an injunction to stop any foreclosure proceedings. Second, we demand a full audit of the HOA finances. Third, we notify the board in writing that you are aware of the conflict of interest and that continuing to target you could be construed as retaliation, which is illegal under Montana law." We did all three. The legal documents were sent via certified mail to every board member and to Sullivan Property Management directly. I also sent copies to every homeowner in Cedar Ridge, along with a letter explaining what I had discovered about our inflated management fees and Brenda's family connection. The response was immediate and explosive. Brenda called me within hours of the letters being delivered, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you spread lies about me and my family? You are going to regret this, Benjamin." "They are not lies, Brenda. They are documented facts. Your brother-in-law's company is overcharging this community, and you have been using your position to protect that arrangement. That is fraud. You cannot prove anything," she spat. "And you are still in violation of community standards. Those fines stand." "See you in court," I said and hung up. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for mid-November, and it was packed. Usually, these meetings had maybe 10 homeowners show up. This time, over 100 people crammed into the community center, all of them holding copies of the letter I had sent. The mood was tense and angry. Brenda tried to call the meeting to order, but she was immediately shouted down with questions about the management fees and her brother-in-law's company. The other 4 board members looked uncomfortable. 2 of them, I had learned through my research, had only joined in the past year and probably had no idea about the financial arrangement. "This is not on the agenda," Brenda protested, banging her gavel. "Then we are putting it on the agenda," someone shouted from the back. It was Rick Morrison, the guy with the work truck. "We want answers about why we are paying so much for property management." The meeting devolved into chaos. Accusations flew. Brenda tried to maintain control but failed, and eventually, one of the other board members, a woman named Carol, called for an emergency vote to suspend Brenda from her position pending an independent audit. The motion passed 4-1, with only Brenda voting against it. Brenda stood up, her face purple with rage. "You are all making a huge mistake. This community needs leadership, not a witch hunt led by some paranoid hermit who cannot follow simple rules." "The only mistake we made was trusting you," Carol shot back. "You are suspended, Brenda. Effective immediately. We will be hiring an independent auditor, and if they find what I think they are going to find, we will be taking further action." Brenda stormed out, and I felt a grim satisfaction, but I also knew this was far from over. People like Brenda did not go down quietly. 2 days later, I woke up to find that someone had filed a police report claiming I had been threatening Brenda. Sheriff's Deputy Mike Torres showed up at my door that afternoon, looking apologetic. "Ben, I have to ask you some questions," he said. "Brenda Patterson claims you have been harassing her and making threats." "That is completely false," I said immediately. "I have not threatened anyone. I have been defending myself against what I believe is a fraudulent targeting by the HOA board." "She says you told her she would regret crossing you." I thought back to our phone conversation. "I said she would regret spreading lies in the context of legal consequences. I never made any physical threats." Deputy Torres sighed. "I figured it was something like that." "Look, I have to document this, but between you and me, everyone knows Brenda is a piece of work. Just be careful, okay? Keep all your communications in writing and do not give her any ammunition." I promised I would, but the false police report rattled me. It showed how desperate Brenda was getting, and desperate people were dangerous. The independent audit took 3 weeks. The auditor, a firm from Billings, went through 5 years of HOA financial records. Their report was damning. Sullivan Property Management had been overcharging by an estimated $40,000 to $60,000 per year. Some of the maintenance work they had billed for had never been performed. And most significantly, Brenda had failed to disclose her family relationship with the company, which was a violation of her fiduciary duty as HOA president. The HOA board voted to terminate the contract with Sullivan Property Management immediately and file a lawsuit to recover the overcharged fees. They also formally removed Brenda from the board entirely and banned her from holding any future HOA positions. But my individual fight was not over. Even with Brenda gone, the violation notice against my firewood and propane storage was still technically on the books. The new board president, Carol, was sympathetic but cautious. "We need to review all recent violation notices," she told me at a meeting. "But we also need to be careful about setting precedents. If we just cancel yours, others might claim favoritism." "Then change the rules," I suggested. "Make it clear that reasonable storage of heating fuel for personal use is allowed with common-sense safety guidelines. This is Montana. People need to be able to prepare for winter." Carol nodded thoughtfully. "I will bring it to the board. In the meantime, we are suspending all fines related to your case." It was progress, but I wanted the matter resolved completely. And I still had not forgotten that Brenda had tried to use her power to hurt me financially, all to protect her family's scam. Then winter really hit. A massive cold front moved through Montana in early December, bringing record low temperatures. We are talking -20, -30 at night. The power grid, already stressed, started having problems. Rolling blackouts were implemented across the region to preserve the system. My preparation paid off. With my wood stove running and my propane generator providing backup electricity, I was comfortable. I checked on my elderly neighbors, offered to let them warm up at my place if needed, and generally tried to be a good community member. But then I started hearing complaints. Several homes in Cedar Ridge were having problems with their propane supply. They were getting low flow or no flow at all. People were calling the new property management company we had hired, but it was not their area of expertise. They managed paperwork and lawn care contracts, not utility systems. Tom came over on the third day of the cold snap, looking worried. "Ben, I think we have a problem with the community propane system. At least a dozen homes are reporting issues." "What kind of issues?" "Reduced pressure, intermittent flow, some have lost service completely." "I have been getting calls because people know I worked on the original installation." He ran a hand through his gray hair. "I checked a few homes. The problem is not on their end. It is upstream, somewhere in the main distribution system. Can you fix it?" "Maybe, but I need access to the main vault and the distribution maps." Sullivan Property Management had all of that, and when they got fired, I do not think anyone made sure we got the documentation transferred. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "So we have no maps of the underground system and no one who knows how to service it." "Essentially, yes. And with this cold, if people lose propane, they could lose their water heaters, their backup heat. Some folks only have electric heat, and with the rolling blackouts, they are relying on propane space heaters to get through the night." This was serious. "What do we need to do?" "I can probably figure out the system if I can access the main vault and trace the lines. But it is going to take time and I am going to need help. The vault is going to be frozen, the valves are going to be stiff, and we are going to be working in sub-zero temperatures." "I am in," I said immediately. "Who else can we get?" We assembled a team of 5 people. Me, Tom, Rick Morrison, who had plumbing experience, and 2 other homeowners with engineering backgrounds. The next morning, we met at the edge of the property where Tom remembered the main vault being located. It took us 2 hours to find it under 3 feet of snow and dig it out. The metal cover was indeed frozen shut. We had to use propane torches just to warm it enough to pry open. Inside, we found a maze of pipes, valves, and gauges, many of them corroded or poorly maintained. "This is worse than I thought," Tom muttered, shining his flashlight around. "Look at this valve here, it is leaking, and this pressure gauge is broken. How long has Sullivan been ignoring maintenance?" We spent the entire day working in that vault, taking turns because the cold was so brutal no one could stay down there for more than 20 minutes at a time. We identified multiple problems: corroded fittings, a partially closed valve that should have been fully open, and a failed pressure regulator that needed to be replaced. We could not fix everything immediately, but we managed to restore flow to most of the affected homes by rerouting around the worst problems. The pressure regulator would need to be ordered and installed once the parts arrived, but at least people had heat. As we were packing up our tools, Rick said something that made me pause. "You know, if someone had completely shut off the main valve, we could have had a real disaster. In this weather, pipes would freeze and burst within hours. We could have been looking at hundreds of thousands in damage across the community." Tom nodded grimly. "And whoever did it could have just walked away. The valve is not locked, and now that we know Sullivan was not maintaining things properly, it could have been blamed on system failure." I thought about my conversation with Tom months ago when I had asked about shutting down the system. At the time, it had been a hypothetical, a way to understand the leverage dynamics. But standing there in the freezing cold, having just prevented a crisis, I understood how serious it could have been. We reported everything to Carol and the HOA board. They were shocked and angry about the state of the system maintenance. Another lawsuit was definitely coming against Sullivan Property Management for negligence, but we were not done with surprises. A week later, I got a call from Deputy Torres. "Ben, I need you to come down to the sheriff's office. We have a situation involving Brenda Patterson." My stomach dropped. "What happened?" "Just come down. I will explain when you get here." I drove to the sheriff's office in town, my mind racing through possibilities. When I arrived, Deputy Torres led me to a small conference room where a detective I did not recognize was waiting. "Mr. Jacobs, I am Detective Sarah Chen. Thank you for coming in." She gestured to a chair. "We are investigating allegations of fraud and attempted sabotage related to your HOA dispute. We understand you have been central to uncovering financial irregularities." "Yes, that is correct," I said carefully, "but I do not understand what this has to do with attempted sabotage." Detective Chen opened a folder and showed me a printout of text messages. "We obtained a warrant to search Brenda Patterson's phone and computer based on the fraud investigation. We found these messages between her and her brother-in-law, Derek Sullivan." I read the messages, my blood running cold. They were dated the day before the propane system problem started. Brenda was telling Derek that something needed to be done about that troublemaker Jacobs before he destroyed everything they had built. Derek responded that he had an idea that would make everyone see how dangerous it is when people do not follow community standards. The next message was Brenda asking if he was sure it was safe. Derek replied, "Do not worry, it will just be enough to cause problems. I still have keys to the vault." "They deliberately sabotaged the propane system," I said slowly, horror and anger mixing in my gut. "That is what we believe," Detective Chen confirmed. "If your neighbor Tom had not been able to figure out the problem and if you had not helped fix it, multiple homes could have suffered catastrophic damage. People could have died in these temperatures. Are you arresting them?" "We arrested Derek Sullivan this morning. Brenda Patterson was taken into custody about an hour ago. They are both being charged with fraud, conspiracy to commit sabotage of a utility system, reckless endangerment, and several other counts. This is serious, Mr. Jacobs. They are looking at significant prison time." I sat back, trying to process it all. What had started as a dispute about firewood and propane had uncovered a multi-year fraud scheme and ended with two people deliberately endangering an entire community to protect their profits. "We need your testimony," Detective Chen continued. "Everything you discovered about the financial irregularities, the timeline of events, the targeting you experienced, it all helps establish motive." I agreed to cooperate fully. Over the next several weeks, I spent hours with prosecutors going over documents and preparing for the potential trial. The story hit the local news, and then regional news picked it up. HOA president arrested for sabotaging community utilities was a headline that generated a lot of attention. Reporters called me constantly, but on advice from my lawyer, I declined most interviews. The Cedar Ridge community was reeling. Many homeowners felt betrayed by Brenda, whom they had trusted for years. Others were angry about the money that had been stolen through inflated management fees. The HOA board worked overtime to stabilize things, hiring legitimate contractors to properly assess and repair the propane system, reviewing all contracts and expenses, and implementing new transparency measures. As for my original issue, the board voted unanimously to rescind the violation notice against my firewood and propane storage. They also passed new guidelines that explicitly allowed homeowners to maintain reasonable stores of heating fuel, with reasonable being defined much more generously than Brenda's half-chord nonsense. My setup was held up as an example of proper preparation and safety. The fines I had accumulated, over $6,000 by that point, were voided completely. The board even issued a formal apology for the targeting I had experienced. Winter continued its brutal grip on Montana through January and February. We had two more significant power outages, and each time I was ready. I also opened my home as a warming station for neighbors who needed it, running my generator to provide heat and hot coffee for anyone who stopped by. Tom and I became good friends through all of this. He helped me design an even better storage system for the following year, with proper ventilation for the propane tanks and a shed for the firewood that was both functional and attractive. We worked on it together during the brief warm days, planning for the next winter. The legal process ground forward slowly. Derek Sullivan tried to cut a deal, offering to testify against Brenda in exchange for reduced charges. Brenda maintained her innocence at first, claiming the text messages were misunderstood, but the evidence was overwhelming. Eventually, both of them accepted plea agreements in March. They were sentenced. Derek got 4 years in prison and was ordered to pay restitution to the HOA for the overcharged management fees. Brenda got 3 years for fraud and reckless endangerment, plus her own restitution payment. Both were banned from ever serving on an HOA board again, which seemed almost comically unnecessary given the circumstances. The civil lawsuit filed by the HOA to recover damages took longer, but eventually, Sullivan Property Management declared bankruptcy, and we recovered about 60% of what had been stolen over the years. The money was distributed as credits to all homeowners, reducing our HOA fees for the following 2 years. As spring arrived and the snow finally started to melt, I stood on my porch looking at my property. My woodpile, partially depleted from the hard winter but still substantial, sat neatly under its tarp. My propane tanks, all 6 of them, gleamed in the sunlight. Everything was exactly as it should be. Carol stopped by one afternoon in early April with a gift basket full of Montana-made products, huckleberry jam, local honey, specialty coffee. "This is from the board," she said. "We wanted to thank you properly for everything you did. Not just for uncovering the fraud, but for how you handled the propane crisis. You could have just taken care of yourself, but you helped everyone." "That is what neighbors do," I said simply. "Not always," Carol replied. "I have lived in a lot of places, been part of several HOAs. Usually, people just complain and do nothing, or they look out for themselves and forget everyone else. What you did, researching the finances, standing up to Brenda even when it cost you money, helping with the propane system in freezing weather, that is special." I felt embarrassed by the praise. I just did not want to be pushed around, and I definitely did not want to see people suffer because of a corrupt system. "Well, you have changed this community for the better. We have new leadership, transparent finances, and people actually trust the HOA now. That is because you were willing to fight." After she left, I sat on my porch and thought about everything that had happened. It had started with such a simple thing, me wanting to store firewood and propane so I could survive Montana winters. Brenda had tried to use HOA rules as a weapon, not because my storage was actually a problem, but because it threatened her family's financial scheme. In trying to force me to comply, she had exposed herself. And in the end, her attempt to sabotage the community system to make a point had sealed her fate. The irony was not lost on me. She had demanded I stop stockpiling supplies, then literally froze when I cut off their corrupt supply of money by exposing the fraud. The following winter was mild compared to the previous one, but I was ready anyway. My woodpile was properly stacked and seasoned, my propane tanks were full, and my generator was serviced and ready. Several of my neighbors had followed my example, setting up their own backup systems. Tom had even started giving informal workshops on emergency preparedness. The community had learned an important lesson. HOAs were supposed to serve homeowners, not exploit them. Transparency and accountability mattered. And preparing for emergencies was not paranoia or hoarding. It was basic common sense in a place where nature could turn deadly without warning. I never heard from Brenda again. According to the grapevine, after she got out of prison, she moved to Arizona to live with her daughter. Derek Sullivan apparently moved to Idaho after his release, trying to rebuild his life far away from Montana and the reputation he had destroyed. As for Cedar Ridge, the community thrived. Property values actually increased once word got out that we had cleaned house and reformed our HOA. Young families moved in, attracted by the mountain views and the sense of real community that had emerged from the crisis. I still live on my 5 acres, still split my own firewood every fall, still maintain my propane supplies and backup systems. The difference now is that no one hassles me about it. In fact, people ask for advice. Last year, the new HOA board asked me to join as treasurer. I declined, preferring to stay in my own lane, but I appreciated the offer. I had learned that I did not need a position of authority to make a difference. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand up and ask questions when something does not seem right. Tom and I were sitting on my porch one evening in late summer, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. We had just finished stacking next winter's firewood, and I had burgers on the grill. "You ever think about how wild all that was?" Tom asked, sipping his beer. "The whole Brenda situation. Sometimes," I admitted. "It feels surreal now, like it happened to someone else. But then I look at my firewood pile and remember exactly how it started." "Over firewood," Tom chuckled. "She could have just left you alone." "Pride and greed," I said. "Bad combination." She could not stand the idea that I was showing other people there was a better way, and she definitely could not afford for people to figure out how much her family was stealing. At least it ended the right way. They went to jail, the community got better, and you got to keep your firewood. We clinked beer bottles to that. The burgers sizzled, the evening was warm, and the mountains stood eternal in the background. Life was good. But the most satisfying part, the thing that still made me feel quietly victorious when I thought about it, was knowing that I had not backed down. Brenda had tried to use the weight of the HOA to crush me, to force me into compliance through fines and threats and social pressure. She had counted on me being like most people, too tired or too intimidated to fight back. She had been wrong. And that mistake had cost her everything while revealing the corruption she had worked so hard to hide. My firewood and propane, the very things she had demanded I remove, had become symbols of independence and preparation. The community had learned that taking care of yourself did not mean neglecting others, and standing up for what was right sometimes meant making powerful people uncomfortable. As darkness fell and the stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, I felt grateful for how things had turned out. I had my home, my independence, my supplies safely stored and ready for whatever winter might bring. The HOA, reformed and functioning properly now, served its legitimate purpose without the corruption that had nearly destroyed it. And somewhere in Arizona, Brenda Patterson was living with the consequences of her choices, no longer able to wield a clipboard and a title as weapons against people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. I flipped the burgers one last time, the flames from the grill dancing in the growing darkness. Tom was telling a story about something his grandkids had said, and I laughed at the punchline. Normal life, good friends, simple pleasures. This was what I had been defending all along, even if I had not articulated it that way at the time. The right to prepare, the right to be independent, the right to question authority when authority was wrong. Those were not small things. They were fundamental. And I had been willing to accept fines, threats, and legal battles to defend them. In the end, that willingness had protected not just me but an entire community. As we finished dinner and Tom headed home, I did one last check of my property. The woodpile was solid and dry under its covering. The propane tanks were secure on their concrete pads. The generator was ready in its housing. Everything was in order. I went inside, locked the door, and sat down with the satisfaction of knowing I had done the right thing, even when it was hard. Even when it would have been easier to just comply and avoid the conflict. Brenda had demanded I stop stockpiling. She had tried to make my preparations into a violation, a problem to be solved through force and fines. But in the end, her own corruption had been the real violation, and my stockpiles had proven their worth not just to me but to the neighbors who benefited when I was prepared during that crisis. She had frozen, both literally in her inability to handle being exposed, and metaphorically when I cut off the flow of corrupt money that had been sustaining her family's lifestyle. The supply she had depended on, the fraudulent overcharges and kickbacks, had dried up the moment someone was willing to look closely at the numbers and ask uncomfortable questions. That someone had been me, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. The fire crackled in my wood stove, burning logs from my supposedly excessive stockpile. Outside, the temperature was dropping as night deepened. Inside, I was warm and comfortable, secure in my preparations and content in the knowledge that I had stood my ground when it mattered. Sometimes the small battles turn out to be important. Sometimes refusing to remove a woodpile leads to exposing fraud and protecting a community. You never know which hill will turn out to be worth dying on until you start climbing it. I had climbed mine, and I had won. Brenda Patterson had lost everything trying to make me comply with unjust demands, and Cedar Ridge was better for it. As I headed to bed that night, I glanced out the window one more time at my property. The moon was bright enough to see the neat rows of firewood, the sturdy propane tanks, all the preparations that had started this entire saga. They were still there, exactly where they should be, ready for whatever came next. And so was I.